Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's research seminar featuring our very own Whitney Airgood-Obrycki, talking about the impact of COVID-19 on renters and rental markets. This is the first event we're hosting this fall in our virtual environment. One silver lining of being able to do these events virtually is that we have many more people than we'll be able to fit in our little conference room on Bow Street. So we have several hundred people joining us today, so welcome. We're very pleased to have you. This, as I said, is the first of our research seminar series. We offer these seminars on Friday afternoons every other week. They are normally hosted and curated by David Luberoff, the Deputy Director of the Joint Center, but he is, luckily for him, off at a lake in Maine celebrating the last week of summer. And so I get to fill in for David, but David deserves all the credit for organizing and overseeing this research seminar. So look for him next time you're back. A few things to point out in terms of other events. Next Friday, the 11th at noon, we're having an open house aimed at incoming and returning students to learn about the Joint Center and the ways in which we engage and support students. So I hope to see you there. And 2 weeks after that, on September 25th, we are hosting a half-day symposium, an event that was scheduled for last spring, but we've rescheduled for this fall, in pursuit of equitable development, lessons from Washington, Detroit, and Boston. This is a bit of an experiment for us to try to recreate a longer event in a virtual environment. And so we will be featuring panelists and discussions on Zoom, but we're also going to be experimenting with software Remo that allows us to have you also go into breakout rooms of your own choosing to meet with students who will be presenting some of their work. So we'll have poster sessions. We'll have an opportunity for people who want to otherwise engage to have ways to do that too. So I hope you'll join us on September 25th for that seminar on equitable development. And then the other event I want to highlight is on October 13th at 7:30 p.m. we will be hosting our annual John T. Dunlop lecture, this year featuring Michael Maltzin, a quite acclaimed architect from LA, and he'll be addressing homelessness, what can and can't architecture do. If you found your way here, you're already on our mailing list. I hope that you do keep up with us, both in seeing events that are coming up and research that comes out. And our blog, we put out a blog or two a week on a whole range of topics. So two logistical points of view. One is that this event is being recorded, and we will, after the event, post it on our website. So if you want to share with your family or friends or see it again, you'll be able to do that. And the other thing is that just want you to note that when we get to the question and answer portion of the event after Whitney is done speaking, please use the question and answer feature. I will be looking through theirs, pulling out questions to share with Whitney. So Whitney will speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll go to Q&A and finish up at 1:15. So with that, let me introduce Whitney Airgood-Obrycki. Whitney is a research associate here at the Joint Center. She's been with us for a few years now and enormously productive. She specializes in work around rental housing, is the lead author on our America's Rental Housing Report, a biannual report that we are well known for. She came to us from the Ohio State University, where she studied urban planning. And along with a lot of the other Joint Center staff, this spring, when the pandemic came upon us, we had put on hold the work on our annual State of the Nation's Housing Report for a host of reasons, one of which was we really didn't know what the state of the housing market was as of April and May last summer. But our staff took an opportunity to turn their attention almost full time to trying to understand the impacts of the pandemic. Again, I'd refer you to our webpage and our blog series, where there's been some 24 blogs looking at this issue from a variety of angles. And Whitney today will share some of that work that she and her colleagues at the Joint Center have done, making extensive use of the Census Bureau Pulse Survey to understand who has been impacted by the pandemic and what their conditions are. Now, I will say, with a caveat, this is as of earlier this summer, and as you all know, a number of important federal supports have ended since then. And so the situation certainly is fluid and evolving, but this is our best glimpse of the subject as it was as of this summer. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Whitney for her presentation. Take it away, Whitney.
Thank you, Chris. And welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I'm very glad you can be with us. As Chris said, so we really spent a lot of the spring and summer, like most people, just trying to make sense of what was happening around us as we really start to see the pandemic take hold. And because of our specialty, we were also just trying to understand what the pandemic might mean for households and housing markets specifically. So we've been busy writing this series of blogs that explore who might be impacted by job losses, what challenges already vulnerable households might face, what housing demand might look like in the coming months, and where markets might be headed. I obviously can't cover everything that we've written about, but today, as Chris mentioned, I'm going to focus on my primary interest, which is renters and rental housing. And beyond just being this my personal area of interest, renter households, and particularly those of color, have been hardest hit by this pandemic. And so they really do deserve our attention right now. So I'm going to be sharing some of the work that I've done on these blogs, but I'm also going to be drawing on some of the great work that my colleagues have been doing over the spring and summer as well. And I just want to acknowledge and thank them for their contributions and all of the work that they've done on this too. The pandemic and the resulting recession has meant a lot of people lost employment, and especially a lot of people lost income in different ways. This definitely raises concerns about the ability of households to be able to afford rent and to keep paying their rent on time. But this crisis is piling on top of an existing affordability crisis, and that context is really important. So I just want to first talk briefly about what the existing crisis looked like so we're all on the same page of where we were going into this. The first bit of context is that there's been a decline in low rent units every year since 2011. And these are units that are renting for less than $600, and we inflation adjust it into 2018 dollars, so it's constant. That trend has really accelerated since 2014 with a decrease of 2.7 million units just from 2014 to 2018. There are a few reasons why we've seen this decline, including the fast growth in higher income renters who are putting pressure farther down on the market, the limited housing supply overall, and new construction that's increasingly expensive to build and is also aimed at the top of the market. Ultimately, what this means though is that lower income households are competing for a shrinking number of affordable options. And in fact, we've seen overall rents just continue to climb. At the end of 2019, we were at 22 consecutive quarters of rents that were rising by more than 3%. And if we accounted for inflation, we were at 30 consecutive quarters of real rent growth, which was one of the longest streaks on record. Over that 7-year period, real rents increased 28%, which is more than 4 times faster than the rise in cost for all other goods. In part due to rising rents, we have this gap then between what households can afford and what they're actually paying. This is a chart of housing cost burdens, which are households who are spending more than 30% of their incomes on rent and utilities each month. And if you look at the blue bars along the bottom, these are severe cost burdens, which represent households spending more than half of their incomes on housing costs. The most recent data that we have on this is from 2018, when 20.8 million renter households were cost burdened, and that included 10.9 million who had severe burdens. Cost burdens did actually increase from 2017 to 2018, despite having a relatively strong economy, and they really haven't come down much from the peak that we hit after the last recession in 2014. Going into the pandemic then, the burden rate was 47.5%, with 1 in 4 renters spending more than 50% of their incomes on housing costs. I'll be talking a little bit later on about how the economic effects of COVID-19 have disparately impacted Black and Hispanic renter households. So I just want to point out that going into the pandemic, more than half of these households were already cost burdened, as compared to about 40% of white-headed renter households. Additionally, nearly 1 in 3 Black and Hispanic renter households had severe housing cost burdens. So when we think about the employment loss that I'm going to show in the coming slides, just recognize that we already went into this with disparate impacts by race and disparate affordability situations. So that was the situation going into the crisis. Let's now look at what's happened since the pandemic started. And I'm going to go through some of the 6 big things that we know so far. And then toward the end, I'm going to talk about where rental markets might be headed and some of the big questions that still remain. So the first thing that we know is that renters were more likely than homeowners to lose employment. Unlike past recessions, unemployment rose quickly and rapidly very early on. So the yellow line is showing current cumulative claims since the recession started. You can see how drastically different that is from previous recessions. We're still seeing initial unemployment claims of about 1 million every single week, not more. So unemployment has definitely been widespread. But loss of employment has hit renter households especially hard. And the bars that are clear to the left are renter households and then broken down by race. This chart is showing survey data, and I did actually update this to the most recent week of the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, which was fielded in the middle of July. You can see from the light green bar, clear to the left there, that almost 60% of renters reported losing at least some employment income since mid-March, as compared to just over 40% of homeowner households. Hispanic renters in particular were most likely to lose employment income. That's the purple bar on the far left, with 68% of households reporting some lost wages since the pandemic began. The survey also has the benefit of asking some forward-looking questions, and we can see a similar pattern for households who reported that they expected to lose income in the following 4 weeks. Given that this was fielded late July, this would be through August, then they expected to still lose income. Just over 40% of all renter households expected to lose employment income. That's again the light green bar clear to the left, as compared to just 30% of all owner households. And we again see on the purple bars that Hispanic renters were most likely to anticipate future income losses at just under 60% of Hispanic renter households. The second big thing we know is that many renters reported that they didn't make a rent payment on time, or they worried about making the next rent payment. 1 in 5 renter households, just shown in the green bar on the left panel here, reported that they did not pay July rent on time, including a small share who had an agreement with their landlord to defer their rent to a later date. Then if we look on the right side, among those that reported losing income, the share with late or deferred July payments went up to 1 in 3. You can also see from the orange and purple bars that Black and Hispanic households were most likely to report late or deferred rent payments. Again, from the left panel for all renters, about 30% of Black households paid late or deferred. And again, to the right panel then, that rose to just over 40% for Black households who also had reported income losses. We again see a similar trend for the forward-looking question then, that asked about their confidence and ability to pay August rent. About a third of renter households had either no or only slight confidence that they would be able to make that rent payment. And the share was again much higher for Black and Hispanic households at more than 40% for each group. So at the time of the last survey, there was really a lot of uncertainty looking forward for these households. And there was also a lot of concern in the housing community because federal eviction moratoriums were ending. And we were also seeing the end of the $600 a week federal unemployment insurance supplement expiring at about the same time at the end of July. But when we look at rent payment trackers, it looks like many renters were still making payments even through August. This is showing data from the National Multifamily Housing Council's rent payment tracker. This has been a great resource that they've provided that's been tracking payments in professionally managed apartments with at least 5 units since April. But these are just showing the most recent 2 months that we have nearly complete data for. And these represent full or partial rent payments that are made cumulatively over the course of the month. So you see the percentage of payments that were made in each week of each month. You can see that when we compare the share of rent payments made this year, which are the orange bars, they're roughly in line with last year's rate, which are shown on the blue bars. They've really only been down by about 2 percentage points and fairly consistently there. There are some limitations to the tracker though. The biggest is that it's only tracking a subset of apartments in professionally managed multifamily buildings, with, as I said, with at least 5 units. And the tenants of these apartments tend to have higher incomes, so they might be more insulated from the economic effects of the recession and more able to work from home. A big question then was whether there might be some vulnerability in the single family and small multifamily rental segment. So we used employment loss projections from March to look at where households with at-risk jobs live. We found that households with at-risk wages were more common in single-family and small multifamily rentals, especially those with less than 20 units, that are also less likely to be professionally managed, and thus might be not as well represented in the payment tracker. The concentration of households with at-risk wages and smaller rental properties could mean that rent payments wouldn't be as high for units that weren't included in the tracker data then. These units also tend to be owned by smaller landlords who have fewer resources to be able to weather long periods of unpaid rent. There are other explanations for why rent payments have largely been on track though. The latest pulse data, for instance, shows that many renter households have been borrowing money from friends and family, used their federal stimulus checks, and put unemployment benefits toward meeting basic needs, including rent. Many renters also reported dipping into their savings, which for most renters tend to be meager to start. And just to illustrate, nearly half of all renters have less than $1,000 in cash savings on hand, so that really isn't going to go far in covering rent. All of these funding sources additionally are not long-term solutions, and they will likely contribute to a greater financial instability for renter households down the road. We might also see a decreased ability to pay rent in coming months as renters run out of these short-term resources. In the long run, widespread employment loss among renters could significantly increase housing cost burdens and challenge affordability. For this analysis, we again used those March employment projections that suggested we would see job losses in several industries, including service, retail, recreation, transportation and travel, and oil extraction. We identified households that had wage earners in these industries and considered all of their wages to be at risk from those industries. We then subtracted any of those at-risk wages from their reported household income, and then were able to calculate a projected housing cost burden, assuming that they would lose all of their at-risk wages and that their housing costs would stay about the same. There are about 12.1 million renter households that have at least some at-risk wages, which amounts to about a quarter of all renter households. Looking at the stacked bar on the left, we estimated that about 4 million households would be newly cost burdened. And if you look at the stripes here, you can see that most of these would be middle to higher income households who tend to have lower burden rates to start with. Additionally, looking at the right stacked bar, housing cost burdens would become more severe for about 5.3 million households who are already burdened. The newly cost burdened households would push the overall renter cost burden rate to 57%, which is about 10 percentage points higher than the current rate. Households in the middle income band would see the largest increase at 18 percentage points. And of course, the lowest income households would see only slight increases because their cost burdens are already so high. But notably, the cost burden rate for very low income households would also rise to over 80%. In a similar analysis, one of my colleagues looked at metros that would be in a particularly vulnerable position because they have both the highest shares of renters with at-risk jobs and the highest shares of renters with existing severe cost burdens. So the overlap of these two indicators produced these 10 metro areas. If renters lost at-risk wages, the rise in the severe cost burden rate would be substantial in most of these metros, including a 19 percentage point rise in the severe cost burden rate in Las Vegas and a 15 percentage point rise in Orlando. Renters are undeniably in a tough spot. Employment really hasn't bounced back, but rent is still due every single month, and there really hasn't been any kind of meaningful relief from that on a broad scale. We have, of course, had state and federal eviction moratoria, including a new federal moratorium that was just announced this week and went into effect today. And while these are definitely important immediate steps for keeping people in their homes, they do not forgive rent, they do not help struggling property owners, and they are not a long-term solution for preventing evictions through the entire crisis. Pairing these moratoria with rental assistance would help stabilize both renter households and property owners through this period of economic uncertainty. So we again used those at-risk industries to estimate how much rental assistance would be needed under 3 scenarios. These are conservative estimates for a few reasons. First of all, they basically seek to get households back to where they were before the pandemic and don't address the underlying affordability crisis. They also assume that anyone with at-risk wages meeting certain thresholds would get state and federal unemployment assistance, even though take-up rates are definitely not 100% there. So we're basically in the second scenario right now, where the $600 a week federal unemployment insurance has expired. And there has been some replacement of that, but it's been kind of patchy so far. We estimated that under this circumstance, about $3.5 billion would be needed each month just to help fill the gap between lost income and rents. In most states, unemployment benefits will expire early next year, and if there still hasn't been significant jobs recovery, the cost would rise to $7.5 billion per month. And I again just want to reiterate that this is just addressing the cost of the pandemic and would not benefit people who were cost burdened before the pandemic but did not have at-risk wages. So we're still not going to be solving the underlying affordability crisis or serving all the people who might be unstable right now. I focused quite a bit on what job losses will mean for housing affordability, but there's also the issue of people who have continued to work at jobs that require being close to others and could increase their risk of catching COVID. On top of that, these workers might live in multi-generational arrangements or in overcrowded living conditions that would make their entire household especially vulnerable. To look at this issue, we used the Department of Labor's Physical Proximity Index to identify high contact jobs that require close proximity to others. We used an index score of 75 as the cutoff, which aligns with jobs that require workers to be within at least an arm's length of others. So this includes waitresses, taxi drivers, post office clerks, personal care aides, and of course, many others. We identified the people working in these jobs and then looked at their household composition. Based on this analysis, we found that 37% of renter households have at least one worker with a high proximity job. The share is slightly higher for Black-headed households, which is the third bar in, at 39%, and is even higher for Hispanic households at 44%. So this again shows how Black and Hispanic households are really bearing the brunt of this crisis in multiple ways. Next, we looked at vulnerable households. These are households with at least one high proximity worker in either a multi-generational living arrangement or overcrowded living conditions. Multi-generational households have an older adult present as a requirement, and these include households with an adult child living with an older adult parent. It can include 3-generation households, or it could just be an older adult grandparent living with a grandchild. We put these households in the vulnerable category because multi-generational households often have complex care arrangements, and it could be difficult to maintain care without exposing the older adults to the virus. Overcrowded households then are those in which there is more than one person per room. And in these households, if a high proximity worker or another household member is exposed to COVID-19, there's usually not going to be enough space to properly self-isolate. We found that there are about 660,000 renter households with a high proximity worker and a multi-generational living arrangement. And there are about 1.4 million renter households that have both a high proximity worker and overcrowded living conditions. So the stacked bars here first show the distribution by race and ethnicity for these two vulnerable household types. And then the stacked bar on the right gives the overall distribution of renter households as a point of comparison. The big finding here is that vulnerable households are disproportionately headed by a person of color. And again, it's Hispanic households that are particularly impacted. So across all of these bars, you see at the very top that purple represents the Hispanic headed household share. Hispanic headed households account for about 20% of all renter households, but they make up 28% of the households that are both multi-generational and have a high proximity worker. They also make up an astounding 48% of the renter households who are living in overcrowded conditions with a high proximity worker. And in absolute numbers, we're talking about nearly 200,000 Hispanic renter households that are vulnerable because of these multi-generational arrangements, and almost 700,000 that are vulnerable because of an overcrowded living condition, plus a high proximity worker. So this is just to say, in addition to affordability, we also need to think about how to house renters safely, both through this pandemic and afterward, and how to support high proximity workers who live in vulnerable households. One thing I've certainly been thinking about a lot is what the pandemic could mean for rental markets more broadly. And there are some things we might see in the coming months, but there are also a lot of things that obviously are still big question marks. We obviously don't know if we'll see the things that I'm about to put on this list, if they're going to happen or if they're going to be lasting trends, but I'm calling this my best speculation at the moment, based on what we're seeing. So aside from very likely seeing a worsening of affordability, we might see some cooling demand, and there are a few reasons why that might happen. One is that there could be a consolidation of households in the form of doubling up or moving in with roommates to make up for lost employment income, and that would decrease the number of existing renter households. We also might see a loss of new demand as young adults continue to live with their parents longer, or as they continue to live with roommates when they otherwise would have formed a new independent household. There also was quite a bit of momentum for homeownership going into the pandemic, and for those who haven't lost employment income and were close to buying a home, we might see more movement toward homeownership that would also reduce rental demand. Unfortunately, our most timely data source on overall demand, which is the Housing Vacancy Survey, has suffered from some data collection issues due to the pandemic, and the second quarter data aren't really giving us a lot of good clues about where demand is at. And if you're interested in that issue, one of my colleagues wrote a really great blog on this topic that's on our website. It's also possible that we'll see diverging trends even within the rental market. We might see less demand for the highest quality, most expensive apartments, in part because households have lost income or moved on to home ownership. And we've already seen concessions for new units with vacancies increasing and rents declining, both in particular markets and among the highest quality units. This probably, however, won't translate to much relief for lower quality and less expensive units, as there will likely just be increased demand for and just as much competition for a limited supply of lower rent units. We'll also likely see increased operating expenses for property owners who have implemented new cleaning and safety protocols to prevent the spread of COVID in their buildings, particularly in larger multifamily buildings. And we could start seeing more pressure on smaller landlords, especially if renters increasingly have difficulty making payments. In turn, if these small landlords have difficulty staying afloat, we might see some shifts in the stock as they move either to home ownership or to the hands of larger investors. So far, multifamily construction has rebounded pretty quickly following shutdowns that were primarily in April and May, but we still might see some lengthened construction timelines this year because of closed offices, canceled planning and zoning reviews, construction moratorium orders, and disrupted supply chains that are all the result of the pandemic. A lot of things feel uncertain at the moment. I think we can all agree. And part of me just wanted to write everything under this column. But the biggest challenge, of course, is that the virus itself and how long this pandemic will continue, which is also related to the other huge uncertainty of what an economic recovery will look like and when that will happen. Aside from these massive underlying question marks, though, a few other key uncertainties that will affect rental markets include whether we'll see continued movement to homeownership, in fact, especially among higher income renters, which would mark a big shift in the trend from the last decade or so. The effect of reduced unemployment insurance is another big question mark. The sense is that the $600 supplement has really been keeping a lot of households stable and afloat and has been helping them make rent payments. There's a question about if and when we'll start to see the effect of these reduced unemployment insurance payments then. Related, it seems that we're headed for an eviction crisis. With the patchwork eviction protections and lack of rent relief throughout the pandemic, I think a big continuing question is how big the eviction crisis will be, when we'll see the largest surge of it, and what this will do to the numbers of people experiencing homelessness, which were already rising before the pandemic. And the final uncertainty that I'll highlight here is just whether we'll see major changes in preferences for the location and configuration of rental housing, and whether that's going to lead to any fundamental shifts in multifamily construction and the location of rental housing. So this is where I'll just say stay tuned, because we're definitely tracking this. These are things we're going to be watching, and we'll certainly be writing about them as we know more and get more evidence. So with that, I'd just like to direct you to our website, where from the first link, you can find all of our COVID-related blogs. And then from the second link, this is our latest rental housing report that came out in January and details a lot of the trends that we saw going into the pandemic. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'm going to welcome Chris back to do some Q&A here.
Great, thank you, Whitney. That was terrific. A lot of information, both from the work we've done this past spring and Joint Center's longer term work on this topic. So questions are starting to come into the Q&A board. I'll do my best to try to pull them together. There's a first question, actually, I think it's a broader question. I think it's a good one for us to revisit to kind of level set everyone's understanding of the way we think about affordability. Tyler Pullen asked a question about where does that 30% standard come from, the 50% standard, and does that still apply these days to what he referred to as the modern renter?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been sort of a labored history of changes in the percentage rule. I think we often revert to a percentage standard because it's easy to calculate. So that has become the basis of affordable housing policy at the federal level, and is sort of an easy, uniform way to look at it. To tease a paper that's coming later in the seminar series, one of my colleagues and I have been looking at whether or not it makes sense to use a residual income approach, and whether or not the 30% standard is really capturing what it takes to have a good standard of living and be able to pay your housing costs. So that certainly raised some questions that one of my co-authors is going to be exploring later in the series. So that cues that up. But I think, you know, the larger question of, you know, is 30 or 50% the right standard is an ongoing thing that we've been dealing with since the beginning of housing policy in some ways. And it's not going to be a good indicator for every household, but it does give us a way to assess the problem on a large scale.
Yeah, I just add to that work that I did with Dan McHugh and Alex Herman at the Joint Center a few years ago. It goes back to 30% comes back from an old aphorism that one shouldn't spend more than a week's wages for a month's rent, which was 25%, got boosted to 30% for budgetary reasons. But it works out pretty well for kind of a working class family. So we use, say, Phoenix, people making $30,000 to $40,000, roughly 30% is what fits. But for the poorest households, it's a lot less. If you're the poorest households and you got to pay for food and childcare and transportation, then you can't even afford 30%. And if you're Bill Gates, you can afford a whole lot more than 30%. So, you know, and the 50% standard comes from another way of trying to target resources. So that became HUD's worst case needs of, you know, we only have 1 in 4 renters who are assisted. How do we pick which ones are assist? And so the idea was, well, pick the people who are most disadvantaged. And that's where the 50% standard came from. So there's some logic embedded in them, but they, as Whitney said, basically become these benchmarks that are used to measure. They're not bad for measurement purposes. They're not necessarily great for policy purposes. Whitney, another question that I'll kind of join together a couple just to get our heads wrapped around this housing check. So one question was, a fellow from the UK, is what share of renters in the US are in the private rental stock? So are in the private market. Mm-hmm. And a similar question was, what share of the market is in these professionally managed apartments?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for the first one, they're roughly, I think the latest was around 5 million HUD subsidized units. And then there's a few more that are in LIHTC. The majority of renter households, and especially the majority of lower income households, are living in the private market though. So there's about 43.7 million renter households in the country, 43.5 million. So the majority are living in the private market. The breakdown for professionally managed is a good question. I just had the tabs up, unfortunately, I don't remember off the top of my head. But so quite a few are in the professionally managed. There is about, what is it, 30, Chris, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about 30% of rentals are single family, and most of those are not professionally managed. So there's a big chunk of the stock that are still in these sort of mom and pop landlord, and they're managing it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, what I heard the other day is 43 million rental units, 19 million are in bigger properties, 11 million are in the NHMC survey. So the vast majority are not covered by that survey. Yeah. There's another question too about what's the impact been on folks living in public housing?
Yeah, So I don't know that quite as well. There are a few places to look for that information, including the association NARO, NAHRO. But there are certainly challenges with people being able to pay rents in the same way, with suffering from lost income, and also just dealing with the spread of COVID, and so implementing new protocols to make sure that residents are safe. And especially, there's a large chunk of public housing residents who are older adults, and who are families with children who are struggling through this in different ways. And so I know there's been some response there around each of these individual issues, both economically and sort of medically.
There's a couple of questions, Whitney, kind of asked you to speculate a bit about the market dynamics. One of them from Dan Immergluck, who he's going to stay forever, but he wanted to say hi. But so I'll group those together. Dan's wondering about the impact on small investors, small property owners, and what do we expect might happen in terms of potential for abandonment or disinvestment, that section of the market. And then there was, maybe I'll ask that one first and come back to some of the market dynamics that are related.
Yeah, so I think we, like most people, are a little bit concerned about the smaller investors and how they're going to make it through this, because based on the Rental Housing Finance Survey, they have fewer resources, fewer reserves to be able to miss a lot of rent payments and still be able to afford the cost of upkeep and mortgages and property taxes and all of that. One of the concerns that we also have is the ability of these landlords to put in the money that's required just for like basic property maintenance and upkeep through this. And so we already have a very aging housing stock, and this certainly leads to questions about the ongoing quality of it and whether or not that's going to be a longer term issue that we're going to see. The small landlords, I'll just say, are a really important piece of the affordable housing delivery system. They own the majority of units that are renting for less than $750 a month in the country. So there's a real concern about losing these owners and what could happen to those properties. I mentioned that, we have really strong demand for home ownership right now, especially among single family rentals. There's a real risk that some of these would convert back to the ownership stock. And then the other piece is just, we saw after the last foreclosure crisis that a lot of single family rentals in particular were snapped up by private equity firms and larger investors. And I think there's a risk that a similar thing could happen if we see a lot of smaller landlords going under through this crisis.
There's a number of questions too, again, about these market dynamics, which, so Whitney right now is in the process of writing the rental chapter for the State of the Nation's Housing Report. And so some of these questions are on top of our mind, but not necessarily ones we know the answer to. But one question had to do with the dynamic in places like the Boston metropolitan area, where there are a lot of university students who haven't come back. What do we expect the impact on the market to be there? I'll just throw a few out, and maybe you can pick which ones you have a better sense to answer. One is whether we expect to see more month-to-month renting. And the other is this question about, so if we see this massive wave of evictions, suddenly as a landlord, then you're looking for a new renter. So what are your prospects for finding a new renter who recently experienced eviction? So how would a massive level of evictions affect the market dynamic? So there's a whole bunch there. Pick which ones you feel like you can move to.
I'll start with the eviction question, and I think that's definitely something we've been thinking about too. What, a huge burst of mobility, possibly homelessness, would do to the whole market dynamic. I think the way that I'm thinking about it right now, which may be wrong, is that for the lowest rent units, there's always going to be very strong demand for them. There's always more people who need affordable units than the units exist. So I get a sense that if there are massive evictions, that sector may still hold up. I guess, I don't know, Chris, if you have a thought on it, but I'm thinking maybe the middle sector is where you might see a little bit of weakening as a result of massive eviction, because you'd still have demand at the bottom. People at the top of the market would unlikely be too much affected, and that kind of leaves the middle to maybe the very luxury market that would have weaknesses. But that's sort of where my intuition is on it, but again, may not be right.
I think we don't really, I mean, certainly in the foreclosure crisis, there were a lot of folks who were evicted too, oftentimes as a function of the property being foreclosed and new owners evicting folks. So I don't know that we have any experience with the millions of renters that we're seeing now
Right.
facing this at the same time. And a lot of it's going to depend on a landlord's assessment of what the market is. And if Whitney, you're my tenant, you and I have a relationship, you can't pay rent, I might be more likely to give you a break if I don't really know who else is coming behind you. So I think in some ways the mom and pop landlords, there might be a better dynamic than the big professionally managed ones. But at the upper end of the market too, there may be more opportunity to provide rent concessions. And so a lot of those have significant financial reserves to be able to withstand downturns in the market, whereas folks at the bottom too. So I would say it's a complicated dynamic. All those different segments are interplaying, and we are going to find out, because I don't think we've experienced
that's the big question marks, but
yeah.
The other piece of the question then about sort of college markets is really interesting too. And I think that's something we've been sort of tossing around, but it's hard to know, in part because we don't know how long the pandemic is going to go and how colleges are going to respond, how long of an effect that's going to be. Being in Cambridge, we certainly are seeing that a lot of people moved out in the spring. Harvard and MIT are closed this fall, so we really haven't seen the same kind of influx in the fall that we would normally see. But part of it seems to be whether or not things open back up in the spring, and what happens with just the length of the pandemic for what's going to happen with college markets in particular.
Here's an easy one, Whitney, and a good one for folks to know about. So the question is the poll survey ended in July. Are we going to get any more information from the Census Bureau?
We are. They're restarting it. I don't know what week, but I think they're running it through October was the last I heard. So we'll get some more data from that coming soon.
So stay tuned. I'm trying to look at some of these other questions. There's one about a woman who's part of a nonprofit in a tourism destination market, trying to gauge how much rent support to budget for 2021. Any And maybe I'll let you off the hook on that one. I think, we have to know what's going to happen with the federal assistance. Are they going to step up or not in a significant way? If they don't, then Whitney's estimate of nationally we need $7 million a month is probably right on. But sorry, I didn't mean to, fill the answer for you.
You're fine.
Let me see. Oh, there's a bunch of questions about the CDC order and how effective it will be. Does it cover? Who does it cover? And I don't know, Whitney, how much you've studied. It's all brand new. How much you've studied up on this. Do you have any comments on your sense of how effective the CDC moratorium is likely to be, or what are the questions we have about it, aside from the fact that it doesn't actually back rent?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's first of all the larger questions about whether it will be challenged and what sort of the legal authority is, which I'm not an expert on. So that's for like the National Housing Law Project and other people who are smarter than me to figure out. But I think from what I've read of the CDC moratorium, it seems to be more inclusive than the previous moratorium, which sort of covered Freddie, Fannie, and FHFA properties and had limited coverage for the 1 to 4 for tenants to figure out if they were covered or not. This has some seemingly fairly straightforward tenant declarations. I think the requirements are that you're under a certain income, you can't pay rent, you've had high medical costs, or like a reason why you can't pay your rent basically, and that you're sort of making a good faith effort to be able to make at least partial payments. So in that respect, it seems like it has better coverage for people who are actually affected. We saw in the last moratorium that there were a lot of issues around enforcement. There were several reports from ProPublica and other outlets that evictions were still happening in properties that should have been covered. And this does have some criminal sort of mechanisms to it, but I would say the enforcement is still a big question mark there as well.
Yeah, and my own read of this too is that there's a lot placed on the tenants in this, and so you have 5 different criteria you have to meet, including you've made all your best efforts to get public assistance, you're paying as much rent as you can afford, your income has to hit certain thresholds, that you also have to be at risk of homelessness or facing much more expensive housing if you get displaced. All those things you have to self-swear to. And if the landlord deems that the criteria don't apply to you, they can still proceed with the foreclosure. And so then the question is, well, who adjudicates that? So there are a lot of questions, I think, about how the CDC moratorium, as much as it could be effective, in practice, how effective it will be.
The previous one, in understanding if you were even covered, was also difficult and put a lot on the tenant to understand, you know, who was holding the mortgage and ownership and all of that.
Right.
So it seems like, you know, it's a little bit onerous either way, but this seems to be targeted toward any tenant who has sort of a reason why they can't pay rent right now.
Right. And you touched on this a little bit, but there's a question of how much difference has there been in impacts across rental markets, different metro areas. And I know we had that one piece you referenced, but any more sense of how it's playing out geographically?
Yeah, we're definitely going to be covering this in the State of the Nation's housing. We're seeing some pretty high cost markets, seeing rents come down a little bit, vacancies go up. It's hard to get a good read on how much of it is related to places that were like hit hard by COVID, if there's been a retraction of demand in those specific metros. But we are starting to see some movement, even as early as I think the second quarter this year, seeing some relief in overall rent growth, some actual rent declines in a few markets. So, well, I guess it's a stay tuned situation because it's coming in the next State of the Nation's housing report.
This is a data nerd question, which since we're data nerds, I'll put out there. Someone's asking a question about how important is the difference between the population weights that the pulse survey comes with, which are between our derived household weights. So for those of you who aren't data nerds, the household pulse survey is actually a survey of individuals. So if you say how many renters have it affected, it's many more than the number it could be, but the number of renters in the universe is bigger than the number of renter households because they're asking individuals. So the Joint Center put out a blog saying there's a way to kind of engineer a household weight so we can actually say how many renter households are affected. But so Whitney, what's the kind of issues in terms of using those, or the ways in which you should be careful with those household weights?
Mm-hmm. One of the concerns we had with just interpreting the pulse survey as it is that for a lot of the responses, if I'm responding for my household, my answer gets attached to all the people in my household. And so that it makes it just a little bit difficult to interpret what you're actually looking at. We also just tend to think in households more commonly in the work that we do because we're thinking of like housing units and who's living in them. So for us, the household weights are really a way to make it a little bit more interpretable, to understand, you know, what we're really looking at in terms of what the household and housing unit sort of effect is going to be. There are, of course, challenges with it. We talked about this quite a bit with some of the people who worked on the survey, and you know, they this sort of pseudo weight, they really trust the percentages, but not necessarily the absolute numbers that would be calculated out of it, which is why we're frequently just reporting percentages of households by renters and homeowners. But I think, you know, regardless, there's issues either way. You get to a similar sort of conclusion, whether you're using the person weights or the household weights. And this just tends to be the way that we think about it and is more interpretable to us.
All right, so getting away from the data nerd questions, there's a person who's been working on homelessness for many years. There's a claim that not everyone facing eviction becomes homeless, but hasn't seen rigorous research on this. What do we know about the likelihood of becoming homeless following an eviction?
I don't think we know a whole lot, honestly, especially from our vantage point where we're using sort of large surveys and trying to understand from, you know, large data sets. In normal circumstances, evictions are pretty low. You'd see a lot of people who would be doubling up with family members or sort of temporary things. There's also questions about whether or not you consider that to be a person experiencing homelessness then if they're in kind of an unstable housing situation. But I personally don't know much about the evidence between the direct link between eviction to homelessness. I think there's certainly an assumed link, but the rate at which that happens, I don't know.
Right. And they were asking for where we could point them. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess the eviction lab at Princeton is certainly a wealth of information about evictions, and they may have some more information on that. What you really need is to be able to follow people who've been evicted to see what comes of them. Matt Desmond is certainly expert in that area. Before Matt, there's very little known about evictions, and so even knowing what becomes of them is difficult to know. But perhaps they could look there. Let's see, what else do we have? This is again back to the market dynamic. So if we do see a lot of financial distress among small property owners, Do we expect to see a lot of speculation in that market? How do we think that'll affect the ownership and the maintenance of that part of the stock?
Yeah, I think that comes back to the similar question of, if these landlords can't stay afloat, what happens? And then this is where I think you might see either people or investors speculating to be able to flip things to homeowners, or you might see things being swept up by larger investors potentially. If we do hit a point where we see a lot of small landlords turning over, and I know it's not, nobody right now is in a really great position, but this seems like one of the opportunities where if there are, local and especially like advocacy groups who are supporting affordable housing, if they can get in and make deals and, buy these properties up, that it would be a great moment for that. But they may again be up against institutional investors who are more savvy, and we might see some of the same dynamics play out as we saw after the foreclosure crisis last time.
Right. One person's been asking about the RAD program. I was putting those off because I'm not sure exactly it's right on this topic, but since you have looked at the public housing and the state of public housing, what's your sense of the RAD program and how it's affecting public housing and its stability and its ability to be there to support the market?
Yeah, there's still, I think I personally still have some questions about RAD. I know others have raised questions. It's the rental assistance. Yeah, the rental assistance demonstration. And it's essentially converting public housing units to other forms of subsidies, usually on the Section 8 platform. So project-based and voucher-based Section 8. It's been a way to get capital infused into properties that have desperately needed it. It's kind of a way to move the money around so that you have a stronger sense of what outlays are going to be for the next few years, and can provide especially housing authorities with a little bit more stability to start to plan and think ahead about capital improvements and about possibly rebuilding structures or doing significant maintenance. So in that respect, the sense is that it's been positive in sort of giving resources and also alleviating some of the regulatory burdens of public housing at the same time. There are still, questions. There are stipulations that it has to remain in the ownership of these public entities or their associated affiliates. But certainly questions about what this means for the sense of like a public good and maintaining an affordable housing stock as part of our public infrastructure in that sense.
There's another little bit of a nerdy question, I guess, in here that's I think an interesting one related to the relative pros and cons of a universal basic income as a means of support rather than providing support for housing, support for food, medicine, etc. I think it's been eye-opening in some respects. I think everyone was worried initially about the effect the pandemic was going to have on people's ability to make rent, as your slide showed. Held up much better than we would have thought through the summer. The presumption is that the generous unemployment benefits were a big part of that. Do you personally have any takeaways from the efficacy of sort of much more just basic cash as opposed to housing specific?
Feels like another teaser for our other paper too, coming up later in the seminar.
Oh, what would that be, Whitney?
Again, this is the residual income paper that Alex Herman is going to be presenting. But one of our big takeaways from that is we looked at what it costs to afford a basic standard of living and then examined some different policy levers and said, so what if everybody had affordable housing at 30%? What if everyone had affordable housing and transportation or universal childcare? What if we try to chip away at each of these little areas? And what it always comes down to is that you need a certain amount of money to afford a basic standard of living, and especially for those at the lowest end of the spectrum, any sort of policy intervention by itself just doesn't get you there, and it takes a lot to get people to a basic and decent standard of living. So I think especially now with unemployment rates so high, and then thinking about our findings from that paper, it seems like some greater income support is especially right now important. But even before the pandemic, there are people who just don't have enough income to be able to pay rent and live well. And so basic income supports seem like they would be a good thing.
It would be a good thing. It is a question of expense.
Yes.
But if we obviously find a way to do it, they've proven to be very effective in terms of, one of the amazing things was I think the poverty rate in the US went down. in the months following the pandemic because the basic income was helping to support people in a much bigger way. You know, there's a series of questions here around landlords and sort of the impact on landlords, the fact this moratorium don't address at all the issue about landlords. I'm not trying to frame a question there, but what's your sense in terms of how landlords ought to be taken into account in terms of thinking about supports for the rental market?
Mm-hmm. I think so. Landlords aren't necessarily sympathetic characters for a lot of people, I would say, is a fair assessment.
When you say that they're not sympathetic characters in terms of in realistic terms, in other words, a realistic or kind of the cartoon character of you must pay the rent?
I think there's a combination of things that, you know, people have this image of landlords and, you know, are making a living off of other people paying them money to do nothing is kind of one of the senses of like, why should I care about a landlord right now? But in our current housing delivery system, landlords are absolutely crucial to making that work, and especially the smaller investors who are owning the low rent units. They're just an important part of the whole ecosystem. The other important piece is that if landlords go under, you know, they're paying mortgage servicers, they're paying cities, and, you know, they're paying for the local fees, and there's a lot of other, there's a lot of other downstream effects. So if you simply say like, I'm not going to pay my rent and I don't care about the landlord, then you don't care about the whole system. And maybe the system needs to be changed in some way, but as the housing delivery system currently is, we kind of need all of these components to work correctly. So that's why I think the eviction moratoriums are an important public health step. And I think the CDC is certainly making that case that we need people to have a place to self-isolate. We need to keep people in their homes. We need that kind of stability. So that's a great immediate step. But if we start, you know, people can't pay rent and can't pay rent, this is all just going to pile up, and then the whole housing delivery system isn't going to work. And, you know, we're going to see effects in state and in local governments as well. So I just think that for those who don't have sort of a sympathetic view of landlords, that, or, you know, we can't say we want to change the whole system. That's one route. But if we want the system that we have, we need to think about the renter households and the landlords and everybody else that's affected.
Yeah, I'd heartily agree with that. And I would say one thing is that in the policy conversations I've been involved with over the last few months, and many of these are think tanks that are heavily leaning towards concern about renters. I would say that there has been a significant level of concern about landlords as part of that conversation, and not the cartoon character version of landlords, but the fact that these are, you know, as you say, vital small businesses that are in many cases not well capitalized, and to presume that they have the ability to withstand this financial impact and not have detrimental effects on the rental stock is wrong. And I think that's recognized by people across the spectrum. So I think the concern about these moratoriums is that they are intended to buy time until a solution is available. But the problem is that we haven't been having that enough of a conversation or coming to resolution about how to get that support that's needed.
It certainly says something that there's such a broad coalition calling for rental assistance right now too, in addition to the eviction moratorium, that, you know, this isn't just advocates, it's not just apartment associations, it's like everyone in the system is saying this is important if we want to do this. And
you know, I think one of the landlord groups that often can be forgotten among here too are the landlords of low-income housing tax credit developments, where there are not rent subsidies tied to whether the tenant pay rent or not. Those are basically pegged to a level of income, and they're working class folks. And if they lose their job, that affordable housing is also at financial risk. So when we think about landlords, there's a whole range of landlords, and many of them are in trouble. We're kind of at time. There's a number of other questions. I think some people coming in would want to dig more into the universal basic income, which is obviously a big topic. We may have made a mistake in just scratching that and talking about the incentives and how one would do that. So I brought that up in part because I think there is this question: why should housing be special and get a subsidy directed to it particularly? We can go into long arguments or discussions about the fact that creates greater political will for it, that there's a need to create supply of housing in certain locations and the like. So For those of you who want to debate universal basic income, we have to reserve that for another time. I'm going to call time here. Whitney, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. For those of you watching, please look at our website, dig in. There's a lot that we touched on here that reflects other work we've done. We have other upcoming events. As I said at the outset, this event has been recorded. It'll be posted on our website. You can see it there. I get some questions about whether or not people who participated will get the slides. I don't think so. I'm not even sure we're going to post the slides, but if you want to look, go back to our website. This recording will be there. The slides are part of that, and we may even be able to post the slides there. So thank you all for joining us. Students, come back next week for our open house on the 11th. Hope to see you at some other events this fall. But thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again. Enjoy the Labor Day weekend, everyone.